Hello and welcome back, listener. You are listening to My Surrogacy Journey, the podcast season 2. We're taking you on a journey of education and surrogacy storytelling. I'm Wes, I'm your host today, and you're in for a really incredible episode. I absolutely love being in the studio, and it's such a pleasure to be speaking to our incredible experts today. Thank you for downloading us again. We have a fabulous sponsor for Season 2 podcast, who are the renowned fertility clinic established in 1989. Herts and Essex Fertility Centre have an outstanding track record. They've created over 7,000 babies as a result of their care over the past 34 years. Herts and Essex Fertility Centre is a leading surrogacy clinic and was awarded Surrogacy Fertility Clinic of the Year in 2018 and 2022. For this episode, I'll be talking to two talented people who are helping us understand and cope with the upset after a failed transfer. We'll be discussing how emotions can be managed, support for each other, and as well as the practical and clinical aspects of doing another cycle. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our guest today. We have Angela Pericleous-Smith. Angela is the chair of the British Infertility Counselling Association, also known as BICA. She's a counselling representative for the British Fertility Society, BFS, and has specialised in fertility counselling with the NHS and private practice since 2014. Angela has written and spoken about emotional impact of infertility and co-authored BICA guidelines for good practice in fertility counselling. So you're in for a really good treat with Angela today. And with Debbie. Debbie has now retired from Herts and Essex Fertility Centre and has joined My Surrogacy Journey as our new clinical and compliance director. Hello, both ladies. How are you both doing?
We're good, thank you. Lovely to be here again.
Good, thank you. Lovely to be here.
Good. Angela, you look so nervous. Don't worry. Come on. Turn that frown upside down. It's really relaxed. I think you're in for a real treat today because we've got two experts with us, both national. I would class you both as national experts, you know, in terms of from a clinical point of view, but also from an emotional point of view. So, I mean, these are some really key components of a surrogacy journey, and it's really important that people consider them. And I'm not saying people underestimate a clinical perspective, Debbie, but I think people know they need a clinical element mostly in their journey. But I think one thing that is really underestimated, one of the things that people really don't consider or think they need is counselling or emotional support. Now, I sometimes, when I talk to people about counselling, you just see the heckles come up and you see their posture change. And I think it's about people having this view that there's something wrong to need counselling or that there's something that needs fixing. And the way I try and position it and the way that we look at it within MSJ is about emotional support. It's not like there's anything wrong with you or you need it or you need a counsellor. It's about making you think about the emotional needs of a journey, understanding what support looks like, and then giving you mechanisms to help you recognise when you may need a little bit of emotional support. Angela, let's jump right into that. You know, how would you respond to that and what's your view on that?
I think historically, the word counselling has a stigma around it, doesn't it? For everybody, really. But I think as the landscape has changed over the years, and particularly since COVID, actually, I think more and more people are aware of their kind of emotional well-being, their mental health. I think when it comes to something like this, and you know, you kind of say about counselling and that kind of reaction you get from people, I think sometimes people are afraid to kind of really share what they're really thinking. Because we all have these thoughts, don't we, and, you know, negative thoughts that we perhaps wouldn't share with other people. And I think that sometimes people think if they share those in counselling, then they might be judged. So there's that real vulnerability and fear about being careful about what to say or what not to say. And I guess one of the key things is really, from my perspective as a counsellor, is really building that relationship with people so that they do feel that rapport and they can, because otherwise if they can't share their innermost thoughts about what they are genuinely feeling, how are they going to benefit?
No, I totally agree. And I think if I look back on both of our journeys, and Michael and I acknowledge this really well, is that one of the biggest things we weren't prepared for that smacked us in the face and really knocked us off guard was our emotional support and how we hadn't talked about it, how we didn't recognise the impact it was going to have, how our thoughts manifested itself into behaviours and all of those things. And it just really could have been so much better if we were prepared for it, if we talked about it, and if we had agreed a plan of how we were going to deal with it and be ready and able to get support when we needed it. And that for me is the overriding thing of both of our journeys that had the biggest impact. And a lot of people that I speak to really early on, they just don't recognise the need for it. And I accept that because, I'll say it again, you don't know what you don't know, but that's the reality. I really try to emphasise when I'm speaking to intended parents that this is a life-changing event that you're going to have in your life. It's going to have lifelong impact, and it's going to change the way you are. If you're in a relationship, you're no longer going to be a 2, you're going to be a 3 or a 4. That in itself is a massive shift of how your life is, and that is inevitably going to have practical impacts, but also emotional impacts. You're about to be a parent, and for those who have been on a really challenging fertility journey, this may be a really long journey they've been on, and then they've had to deal with all of those emotions along that journey, and now it's changing where the reality is kicking in, where they actually might be about to be parents, and how do they deal with that?
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's that real fear, isn't there, of kind of admitting that, what are we doing? We're changing our lives from 2 to 3. What are we actually doing? Do we really want this? I think it's probably quite fair to say that most people, whether they've had a fertility, a surrogacy journey or naturally conceived, I think most people have that kind of fear of, oh goodness, what are we doing with our lives? And we're about to take that responsibility. And I think when it comes to kind of surrogacy and for intended parents and surrogates, if they're kind of trying to talk to their family and friends about it, what I notice is a lot of the feelings kind of get brushed under the carpet, or don't worry about it, or just be positive, or don't think like that. So people really don't have that space to really be able to share what they're feeling without being closed down.
Sure. And we are going to get onto the bit that this podcast is titled, in terms of failed transfers. But I think this is really relevant because it's about what you have to deal with to get to the point of getting it to transfer, and then what emotionally you're dealing with once you are ready for a transfer, and then to deal with the results. So it is kind of all interlinked. And I don't know if we Michael and I don't talk about it too much, but in between Talulah and Duke, we did have a failed transfer, and all of the emotion and everything that was attached with that. And that wasn't, certainly because Talulah had been a first-time transfer, failure was not something we'd prepared for. And I think a lot of people don't prepare for it. I think if you're a heterosexual couple being on a fertility journey, you're probably more used to a failed transfer than most, and you already kind of going through the motions and preempting what that is going to be. But I don't think you can really prepare for it, because if you have been on a fertility journey, you're in a different aspect now because you're using surrogacy, where the emotions potentially are different, the dependencies, the anticipation, the expectations might be different to the ones that you had in your own fertility journey.
Yeah, I think there's so much investment, isn't there, in a fertility journey, a surrogacy journey, time. Waiting and time and matching, emotional investment, financial investment. There's so much real investment. I'm sure, Debbie, you'll be able to kind of tell us more from a clinical point of view. But I think, not that people have this naivety, but you're doing surrogacy because you hope and think and want it to work. And there's kind of this perception of, yeah, we'll do surrogacy and it'll work. And if it doesn't, then that kind of devastation is really profound. Yeah. That for everybody, I think, and for couples that have been through their own fertility journey before surrogacy, it's kind of an additional loss, and there's so much investment to get to a place where their acceptance of going through a surrogacy journey. I don't think anything can prepare you. And sometimes people come to me and they do say, I want to prepare for if it doesn't work. I must say that does tend to be rarer, because often there's kind of that hope it is going to work. But it's almost, in some ways, you can't prepare for that true devastation until you're there. No. You can be, obviously, a key thing is being aware that it could happen and thinking about how you might manage that and cope. But until you're actually in that place. And I liken the loss to, because it's that invisible loss as well, isn't it? Particularly for people around you and your friends and family. I liken it to a death of a person. We don't suddenly have that intense grief and then the next day expect to be okay. But the kind of invisibility is around with surrogacy. And I think it's fair to say that's for the intended parents as well as the surrogate, that big element of shock that it hasn't where the transfer hasn't been successful.
Yeah. So let's take it back a little bit and let's talk about, in preparation for a transfer, if there's any ideal way to do it from both a clinical and an emotional point of view. Deb, let's talk to you about how you would encourage people to prepare for transfer, because if they are a heterosexual couple, being in a clinic for an embryo transfer might be quite triggering for them. If they're a same-sex couple, they might not necessarily understand what their role is or how involved they can be. Let's just pick that bit up. So I think it's a really important part about not just about dealing with it if it has been a failed transfer, but how you could potentially prepare better going into a transfer.
Communication is key. You really do have to speak to the people that are looking after you. So that's your clinic, your clinicians, your nurses, your counsellors, the embryologist. Make sure you're asking the questions. And sometimes you might not know the questions to ask, but don't be afraid to speak up and say, I don't really understand that. What's going to happen? There's two perspectives there. So we need to prepare our surrogate for the actual clinical, physical bit that needs to happen. She's taking medication. She needs to know that she needs to be at the clinic for certain scan appointments, and then preparation for that transfer time. The surrogate generally will have had pregnancies successful in the past, so she's full of hope that she's going to help this intended couple, whether they're heterosexuals or same-sex. They are full of hope, and you can't knock that out of them. You need to make sure that you're being transparent, that you're being safe with them, that they have all of the correct information so that they know and can expect what's going to happen at each available appointment. When it comes to the intended parents, you've both hit it quite nicely. Our heterosexual couples will have had quite a struggle of a journey unless they've known from the outset that they do need to have or go down a surrogacy pathway. But generally, they've been on a rocky road of fertility. And so managing their expectations is really key, because we do know in the fertility world, 50% of transfers fail. And that's the key. And we don't want to start off with that, but we do need to be fair to let them understand that it can fail. And they will come with this massive hope. This is the end of their journey, but this surrogate is going to get them pregnant.
Yeah.
And I think we have to prepare for that.
And I think that's a really good stat there, Deb, to put it into perspective. And I think a lot of people just assume that it's going to work first time. I mean, there is a higher than average rate for first time success. I think if you're potentially using donor eggs, healthy sperm, you've got all the recipe for success there, but that doesn't automatically assume that you're going to get that success. And I think when you just highlighted, 50% won't be successful, I think that really does help people put this into perspective.
It does. And obviously, as clinicians, we'll never sit there and say to our patients, 50% are going to fail. That's not how we're going to operate. We always will lean to the glass half full rather than the glass half empty. But with the same-sex couples, when they come in, they are full of hope. They don't see that they've got a fertility issue. This is going to work. They have no expectations. And sometimes it's harder to manage the same-sex guys that come through our clinics because of that hope that there's no way they're going to fail. Why should they fail?
Yeah. And often they haven't been through an unsuccessful IVF journey, have they, to get them there? So they have a very different perspective about IVF. And often it's the first time they've been exposed to IVF and, the assumptions around it. I really think that it would be really helpful for people to understand that, to go into this with a view that, yes, we may be successful, but we also may not be successful. And I think if you have both sides of the coin in equal measures, you would be better prepared. Because I always think you've always we certainly did, thinking that we were going to be pregnant and that it was going to be successful. And I think when you're not, it really knocks you. But I think if your expectations are managed beforehand better, I think it will allow you and your surrogate to hopefully navigate through what is sad news that you haven't been successful, if that's the case. And it's how do you get that? Angela, is there anything that you would kind of suggest in terms of how you would approach that pre-transfer and the communication between the team to manage expectation better?
Yeah, it was interesting listening to Debbie on the clinical point of view of, how that's conveyed to patients, if you like, because in some ways, that kind of managing their expectations for me is a big part of the counselling. How do we manage their expectations so that if things do go wrong? And I always say it's not about going into it all positive, but equally it's not about going into it all negative. It's about being balanced. And, I'm forever saying this, the old-fashioned scales with the weights that you put for every thought you have, So that exciting thought that this is going to work, what do you need to put on the other side of those scales to balance that? Focus on what you do know rather than what you don't know. And that can be really helpful just in terms of getting that balance again between walking into it all excited and this is going to work, but equally we don't want people walking into it, you know, all negative.
If you were all one side or all the other, you're potentially asking for trouble. So I think it is about having enough weight on both sides so that you do approach it with a balance. You know, with my Surrogacy Journey, we're all about balance. I mean, it's one of our kind of guiding principles is about balance. And I think that really sums it up well. It is about having that really balanced approach to, like Debbie said, this could go either way. You could put enough on both sides and it could easily swing one way or the other. There's nothing that's going to tell you otherwise. And I think it's been about being prepared for either side.
Yeah, I think people do know that, you know, the potential that this might not work, but there's kind of being prepared for that, but it's still not going to take away the emotions. And I think in some ways that's what you need to be prepared for. That even though logically, rationally, you're aware that it might not work or there's only a 50% chance. But I think sometimes the shock comes that people weren't prepared for how they were going to feel about that because rationally they knew that was a possibility.
Yeah. And I also think sometimes, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, Angela, it's like sometimes you can't prepare for everything and you can't prepare. Like if this is the first time that you've had this type of news, you don't know how you're going to react to it. You don't know how potentially your partner's going to react to it. You know, you can't literally prepare for everything, but I think it is about putting as much in place so that you are as mentally prepared as possible. Then you have the mechanism or the support network that when you do get the news you weren't expecting, you have someone that you can help you manage that piece that you weren't expecting, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. Again, from like counselling point of view, kind of really challenging their thinking. I think sometimes when we think of challenging people's thinking, we think of it being confrontational. And sometimes with family and friends, like I was saying, that sometimes they get, you know, brushed under the carpet. But in counselling, you can kind of really explore, challenge their thinking
encourage their thinking,
explore that thinking, and how about this and how might this be and how might that be, not knowing how that will definitely be until they're in that position, but kind of being prepared.
Yeah, I mean, I really like the word challenge actually, because I often have chats with intended parents and they're at the start of the journey and they just don't know what's ahead of them. And sometimes they just have this approach where they think everything's going to be fine, or they don't like being challenged because they assume that they don't need this emotional support. And I'm really happy to challenge people and push back with people because I think you have no way of knowing what's ahead of you. I'm not saying we know everything that's ahead of you, but we've been through it and we know some of the real sticking points that we think are going to really take people off guard emotionally. And I think if you don't have that mindset where you're prepared to listen to how people think and the advice people give you about what the journey entails, then I think you should be challenged. And I think it's our job as an organisation to challenge you and to get you ready. Because if you just think everything's hunky-dory and you don't want to listen to anyone else, you're quite likely to come into a bump in the road that's going to kind of knock you off guard.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sticking with the 3 C's now today. Challenge doesn't mean confrontational, but also
healthy challenge.
Healthy challenge, but as Debbie mentioned as well, communication is key, and whether that's with your partner, with your intended parents, your surrogate, or with the counsellor. We've got 4 C's now.
No, I totally agree. And I think when we started my surrogacy journey, putting this emotional support element into it was really, really important to us. And it's one that we've really pushed for all the way through as a member benefit, but also really challenge people for, because I do get people regularly telling me they don't need counselling, or we've had implications counselling at the clinic, we don't need anything else. I'm like, okay, well let's unwrap that a little bit and let's talk about it. But it is really, really important to us, and one thing that is massively underestimated. So we've kind of talked about the preparation pre-embryo transfer in a way that could do that. I want to just quickly pick up on from a surrogate piece, because I know from our own experience, surrogates are expecting it to work as well. They've got proven fertility. You know, if I think back to some of our surrogates who haven't been successful with first or second, they weren't not expecting it to happen. And I think one of the things that happened with our surrogate is that it really knocked her confidence. It really took her off guard. She wasn't expecting it to fail. Every time before she'd got pregnant like that, and on this occasion she didn't. So she really took it personally that it was her who had failed, and she was letting us down. And I think those are some of the conversations that you could potentially help have with your surrogate pre. This is no one's fault. This is in the hands of science, and we can't impact it. Everyone's doing their bit, and if it doesn't work, it's no one's fault.
Mm-hmm. That is definitely something I would want to explore with a surrogate and the intended parents. If this doesn't work, what might that be like, and what might that be like for the relationship? Because often the surrogate does have this sense of failure, particularly if it's a friend, but in my experience, surrogate and intended parents do become very close. That kind of real sense of guilt that they've let them down, they've done something wrong, they're to blame. It's really profound for the surrogate as well. And again, what I think we can easily do from kind of a clinical point of view is kind of focus on the failed transfer and from the intended parents' point of view, but actually it's profound for the surrogate as well, and there's lots of emotions. And like you say, particularly if they have had multiple pregnancies with no issues, they think they're going to come into this and have another pregnancy, and when that doesn't work. And also they know how much it means to the intended parents.
Of course, they're so invested in the journey, and they feel as if it's them, that it's the surrogate that's let them down. And I also sometimes feel that, in this scenario of a failed transfer, the surrogate is not only having to deal with her own emotions, but she's then having to deal with the emotions of the intended parents as well. And I think in some cases that's quite difficult for a surrogate to deal with. And I think we have to acknowledge that they're also dealing with their own, as the intended parents are, but often the surrogates feel like they've let the intended parents down. It's them that's responsible for this scenario that they're now in. Yeah.
And again, that's kind of something to explore and raise with them. How might that be? Would you need some space from one another? What would it be like if you had space with no contact for a week, or would you want contact straight away? And again, that excitement and hope of, we'll be fine. We know that it might not work, and there's 2 embryos or 3 embryos.
And I think that's a really key bit, and that's one thing I would really encourage people to do is, before an embryo transfer, talk about what if it's successful, amazing, what happens there. And it's not less of a conversation, but there's not as much negative emotion involved in it. But also have a really clear conversation about, what if it isn't successful, and how are we as a team going to deal with that? What do you think you would want as a surrogate? And what does the intended parents want, and how do you communicate that, and what does that look like? Everything you've just said, Angela, but I think not enough emphasis is put on if it fails, then you potentially have a gap in communication, or I think there needs to be equal emphasis put on pre-embryo transfer to the reaction or the response of, well, if it's positive it's this, if it's negative it's this. And again, I think it's about having that balance that you talked about earlier on.
From a clinic perspective as well, we always make sure that there is clear guidance on what do they do when they get that result. Who do they tell first? Does the surrogate ring the IPs? Does the surrogate ring the clinic? So we always encourage, from a clinic perspective, that the surrogate rings the clinic, because she will need that first-hand support with that negative result. Number one, from a practical clinical point of view, what does she need to do with the medication, etc.? But then give her the support to give that news to her intended parents. But even when they've got the best relationship, that's really difficult to put that ownership on that surrogate.
It is, totally.
So we, they should be getting the support from their clinics to deliver that news in the best way that they can. It's not hard. It's not easy to deliver, whichever way.
And you know what? There's no perfect scenario. This doesn't exist, does it? About prepping before an embryo transfer, the embryo transfer happening, and then waiting for the results. There's no perfect scenario. But I think if one thing came out of this podcast, it was that people took a more objective view of both sides of the coin and discussed the possibilities of both sides of the coin pre-embryo transfer and all the way through, I think they'd be better equipped that if they did get positive news, and hopefully they didn't, but if they did, they would be better versed and they would know what the plan was. And I think that's what it's about. Let's know what the plan is, whether it's positive or negative. And I think you should always plan for both.
And even when you give that information at the beginning, when you get that result and that surrogate is panicking, thinking, okay, how do I give them this news? Ring the clinic first, get the information from the clinic. Then you're a bit more armed to then go to your intended parents and say, I have let the clinic know this is what I have to do now from a clinical, practical point of view. They can focus on that bit with the surrogate also, and then the surrogate can deliver the news, etc. And then the intended parents can be followed up by the clinic also, must be, to support them in a different way. Sometimes they all want to come together. Sometimes, like Angela alluded to earlier, they just need that little bit of separation to deal with their own emotions before they can come back together, regroup, say, okay, we've taken a breath, this is where we go next, and this is what the clinic has advised. So you've got the information, you can make then informed decisions about your next steps.
Totally. And also when you're dealing with a set of intended parents or a team, surrogate and IPs, who have really low embryo numbers, they might only have 2, and 1 is a really devastating blow. That puts more and more pressure on everyone, doesn't it? It's great if you've got a really good number of embryos, but a lot of people don't. And I think that adds a different dynamic to both the physical and the emotional element. There's so much riding on this transfer. We have intended parents who have 1 embryo, we have intended parents who just have 2. It's a lot of pressure, and we often hear for surrogates that working with intended parents who have a low number of embryos is a lot more pressure than it would be working with intended parents who have more. Do you see that, Debbie, in clinics?
Yeah, so obviously when you're working with such low numbers, that as can often be the case, there is so much riding on it, and the expectations for commitment to that cycle and to make that outcome positive is a tougher one, because there is so much more riding on it. You manage those expectations to say, and I don't harp on about 50%, but it is making sure that we help them navigate their way through that, and so that they have some understanding that there's a lot riding on that 1 embryo. It's got to go through so many processes. It's got to survive the thaw. They might not even get to the embryo transfer bit. And you try and manage that with them by discussing each step and what needs to happen at each step, so that they can manage their thoughts, their processes, and the clinical perspectives at each part.
And so how do you feel that impacts from an emotional point of view? Obviously, it puts more pressure on everyone, doesn't it, in terms of for it to be successful? How would you suggest people kind of manage that?
Again, that's that kind of huge investment that I was kind of talking about. When there is 1 or 2 embryos, the intensity of this and the investment of this working, it's massive for people. In terms of people managing that, in some ways, again, that is about exploring beforehand. If this doesn't work, what might that be like? Yeah. What next for you? If anything, what is that really going to be like in your life? And I think this kind of feeds back into why it is really important to hypothetically go through that scenario with people, and how they will manage that, how they will manage their emotions, whether they will want that contact, because they need some time and space as well to kind of come to terms with that. And some people will want to be around their surrogates and some people won't. And again, those kind of intricacies about, who delivers the news, again, that's kind of something to broach with people, because they're not aware of these intricacies, that they will get a telephone call or they'll come into clinic, and should they all be there or 1 be there, and who's going to be around? I guess I'm thinking as well of single people going through this. Who's going to be around for him with the negative news, and have they kind of considered, if it's negative, how do you want that being relayed to you? Do you want a telephone call? Do you want that in person? Will you have...
Because I think it's such a personal thing, isn't it? And it's about, we always, when we are giving results, potentially about being matched and stuff, we always ask people, do you want a phone call? Do you want it in a WhatsApp message? Do you want it in an email? Because I think people like to receive information differently, and not everyone wants it in the same way. I personally think that if I give you some information in a WhatsApp message or in a text, you are going to process it in a different way than me giving you it in person. And this is not just about the person receiving it, it's about the person giving it as well. It's about making sure that we can give everyone what they need so that they're receiving information in a way that is right for them.
It's always really easy to give good news. A surrogate will always, when you give her the choice, she will always want to be that one that rings her IPs and says, we're pregnant. But when she has to deliver the bad news, invariably she'll ask for support or ask for the clinic to deliver it.
And that's okay, right?
And that is absolutely okay.
And I think that's because, one of the things that surrogates get out of being a surrogate is this, this piece of being able to give that good news, and the what they get back from those intended parents when giving such good news, or when the baby's born and seeing that first handover of they've just delivered a baby and it's given straight to the IPs, and they see that what they've done, the impact it has on those intended parents. And I think that is a really fair way to deal with it. But I get it. You, Debbie, and potentially Angela, are not used to giving bad news, but you're trained in a way to deliver it and understand the impact of it. Not everyone on this journey is, and it's about, you've got a professional resource around you with My Surrogacy Journey, and it's about utilising that to, one, get the support you need, but two, manage the situations in the most productive way possible, if that's such a thing. So let's look at moving forward, and so we've had a failed transfer. How do you move on from that, and how do you approach it once you've kind of picked yourself up a little bit and kind of had the support to help you start managing the emotions associated with it? How do you then start moving forward? From a clinical point of view, Debbie, what would that look like?
So it depends on where you're at on the journey. Have you got embryos left?
Mm-hmm.
So that's quite an easy fix, because you can think about, okay, when everybody's regrouped and we've had enough support, enough counselling, and we're ready to think about starting a journey again. And the clinicians will need to be reassured that you are all in the right space. We can't have just the surrogate pushing to say, yes, we want to go again, and the IPs are just not ready because they're now scared of another failure. You need to make sure everyone's on the right foot. So having embryos in storage is an easy fix, because you just need to then plan from a clinical, practical point of view when it is safe to start again. And that's generally, we want the surrogate to have, when we talk about the failed cycle, she needs to have that withdrawal bleed, and we want her to have another clear cycle. That's generally. So within 6 weeks, you could potentially be starting again if that's appropriate for you. If, on the other hand, you don't have embryos and you need to think about, okay, what's the next step? So if it's a heterosexual couple and they've used up their last embryos and they're no longer able to create their own gametes and create their own embryos using their gametes, then they might need to think about donation. And that's another different consultation. And is the surrogate ready to sit and wait for that to happen? There needs to be conversations around all of that. Or is the surrogate keen to move on? And potentially that might be another set of intended parents. That's what MSJ will support and help with all of that. And so then thinking about donation and creating new embryos. You need to prepare all of the surrogate and the intended parents in readiness for whichever pathway they need to choose. Sometimes the intended parents will say, that's it, we're done. We just can't do this anymore. And that's particularly with heterosexual, because they've been on a rocky road. They've invested everything they possibly can. They've got no more embryos left. And that's the time. But again, MSJ will pick you up and make sure that you're not just left in the outer regions. You're going to be supported and help you make those decisions of moving on. And that is tough. The surrogates desperately want to help you. But sometimes there's an end of that road that we need to support you on. And
it's about moving on to the next phase, whatever that is for you, and making sure that you are supporting that next phase. If that next phase is accepting that you aren't going to have a family and you're going to kind of get on with your lives in whichever way you can, or you're going to then move down creating
adoption
more embryos
or fostering or
and
whatever.
I think for some people, that last embryo that wasn't successful, that might be their last opportunity for genetic link, and for some people that's really important, and you've got to mourn the loss of that as well, and you've got to come to terms with it. They might not be ready to talk about donor yet, but it's about when they're ready. And Angela, from an emotional point of view, what do you think is the best advice for people who have had a failed transfer and are then ready or when are they ready to move forward, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I think it varies for everybody as to when they're ready to move forward. I think one of the key things is actually going back to the clinic and having the opportunity to have a discussion as to what has just happened. And sometimes people put that off, sometimes people want to do that straight away. It kind of helps to bring a finality around that cycle, regardless of what they're going to do next, whether they're going to have another cycle of treatment or whether they've got no more embryos and that's finished, and it's kind of really exploring what the other options are for them. And just also where it might be that after one, it might be a different surrogate. The surrogate might not feel she's able to do that again, or the intended parent or parents might choose to have a different surrogate. And again, that's kind of coming back to, you don't know what you don't know, do you, until you've actually been through it and done it. And some people do continue, but there's kind of that real opportunity to have that space to really explore how it feels now, what that future looks like, how do they process that loss and grief, and what are their other options going forward, which might be more surrogacy, might be adoption, it might be fostering, it might be childlessness, or it might be their family is already complete. Whichever of those it may be, they're all different to the life they thought they were going to have, and they've already psychologically imagined, but physically that's not happening. So I guess it's, that kind of real exploration and restructuring of that life, and giving them the time and space, and again that kind of gentle exploration, challenging their thinking, and again, when is enough?
Yeah, that's a really tough question for a lot of people. A lot of the hetero couples that I speak to, or single people, say they wish they'd have made that decision sooner. They wish they'd have stopped IVF and focused on something else sooner. So I think they're more aware of that particular piece.
That is a really important aspect of the clinical role, because it's very easy to help people get on that fertility road, but it's much more difficult to help them get off. But it is also our responsibility as clinicians to support that. And
I really don't think we should underestimate the need, the desire, and what that feels like to be a parent for some people, and how strong and how constant that need is, and how people can't shake it off. I hear it all of the time, and as a parent myself, I can absolutely understand it. And I think it's more prevalent and much harder to deal with when you don't have children at all.
Always.
And it's how do you navigate through that when there's such a desire to be a parent. I think it can all sometimes be consuming. It can overtake your life, and it can be the only sound you hear, because you're so, I don't want to say the word desperate, 'cause I don't mean it in that way, but it consumes you, and it's everything you want.
You'll give everything to it.
Yeah.
Emotionally, financially, the relationship breakdowns, everything will be invested in that pursuance of having a child, having a family. Yeah. And none of us that work in this industry ever will underestimate that, because essentially that's why we're all here, to support family making. And when it doesn't work, it affects us as much as it does those couples that are embarking on their parenthood journey.
And I think as an organisation, I know I can say this hand on heart, every member of our team is totally invested in everyone's journey. We live that journey with them. We're with the highs, we're with the lows. We're not robots. We don't. We have emotions, and when people fail, we feel it too. And when people succeed, it's just as overjoying for us to see it as it is for them. So it is a. I sometimes feel like it's a bit of a curse for us, because we're so invested in it, and we live and breathe this. But it's tough dealing with the when you can't make something better for someone, or you can't create a solution for someone. It's really tough from our team point of view to kind of navigate through that as well.
The smiles and the tears.
Yeah,
always.
Quick question, Angela. So if you're in a relationship and you have a partner going through this, how do you manage each other's side of it? Because I think often, you just assume that as a one, you're a couple, and that there's emotional needs and that they're just going to be dealt with as one. Well, we're all different people. And I know just from my own personal relationship that Michael deals with things very differently to how I do. Just throwing that into the mix, how would you approach that in terms of making sure that you're looking out for each other as well and not just trying to deal with this as one journey and one emotional support that you both have to kind of get into?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, because you're absolutely right. That kind of, here you are as a couple, so you must be the same. But actually, it's very different for each of you, regardless of, you know, if it's a hetero couple, a same-sex couple, male and a female, two males. Each party is going to have a different experience and be impacted and have different thoughts and feelings. And again, that kind of real communication and that exploration of possibilities, and the two people in a couple often have different coping strategies. And what are those coping strategies? Have you talked about your coping strategies? What do you need from one another? Kind of that real exploration of, what is this kind of going to be like? Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? How might you manage? What if one of you wants to talk about it? What if one of you doesn't?
And what if you don't see the signs that, because I know just from and Michael probably killed me for saying this, but sometimes I really want to talk, but I don't want to talk, but I really want someone to ask me. And so then I can just have a vehicle of talking. I don't know what it is, but I don't say, oh, shall we talk about it? Because that's not how I'm built. Do you know what I mean?
I've got a clear memory of a couple that I'd nurtured through, I can't remember how many, 7 or 8 failed cycles, and I was about to deliver yet again another negative result. And the guy said, they're a heterosexual couple, they left the clinic, went home, and I just had this feeling about the guy, and I rang him separately on his own, and he said to me, how did you know? And I said, just the feeling in that room. And he said, can I come in and talk to you? And we gave him the space for him to come back into the clinic on his own. And wow, what a session we had with him. There was 2 of us ended up coming in because he asked to speak to another member of staff. And he was then able to pick himself up and say, okay, right, now I know how I'm going to support her, because he was at such a severe loss. And it's not that we forget the partners in the room. We very much do. But sometimes you're so focused on the person that's had the failure that you forget that partner that's suffering so much.
Yeah. Or you might be that one who's always emotionally strong and deals and helps support your partner because they need it more. But then it's like, who's supporting you? Yeah. And everyone has limits, right? You all have limits about how much you can take. And you know, these journeys do sometimes push you to the limits.
Yeah, and with the same-sex couple, see, I've got all these different scenarios. We'd used up the last embryo for one of the male partners. He'd had 2. And his husband said to him, but it's okay, we've got mine to use. And he totally disregarded his feelings that was my last chance of a genetic link to a child. Yeah. And as much as they were going to come together, and they did have a child. But he was trying to be supportive and say, but it's okay, we got these. But he just didn't get. He
hadn't anticipated the impact that would have had. And
touching on what Angela said, helping them prepare about if this scenario happens, how we're going to support you dealing with it. It's a tough one always, whereas when you're sitting in front of a couple, as we all know, we don't want to be completely negative, but we have to prepare our couples so that they can be better informed when they hear that news. Okay, I've got to take a breath, I've got to grieve, I've got to do this, but I know how I'm going to move forward because I've got the tools and I've got the support around me to help me do that.
Amazing. Last words from the both of you then. So Angela, what would be your takeaway from today and your key, if the listener just took away one thing from today, what would it be?
For me, no thoughts or feelings are abnormal. They're all very normal. There's no such thing as a silly thought. And what is really important is, please do engage in that support that's available and on offer for you. But importantly, and from this latter part of the conversation, not necessarily as a couple, but by yourself too, that you can access that support to be able to, it might be exploring more about yourself. If you're aware of what your own thinking patterns and behaviours are, and what your needs are, to be able to communicate that better within the relationship, because this, going through the surrogacy process is a really complex thing. It's a lifelong decision and has lifelong implications.
Thank you. Debbie, for you?
I strongly feel communication between all parties involved. I think if you keep talking to each other, explore how you're feeling, don't be afraid to speak up and say, actually, you're a surrogate, actually I'm not ready to go through another cycle. Be honest with your intended parents. And if the intended parents are thinking, actually we're not ready to do this again, but the surrogate's pushing because she wants to get on and do the cycle, just be open and transparent and communicate. Just be fair to each other and you'll find your way through wherever that path will take you. Just communicate.
Amazing. Thank you both. It was really interesting. And I think for me, the biggest takeaway would be around preparing for failure at the beginning as well, and not just preparing for success. It is about having that in equal measures and having that communication and talking about, if this happens, what do we do? If this happens, what do we do? And having that real pragmatic and practical approach so that all of those conversations have happened. And then if you do get a positive one, great, move on. If you get a negative one, you can still move on, but you've prepared for it as well. So for me, this is a really powerful episode, and I hope you enjoyed the episode today. Angela and Debbie, thank you so much for your time, as always. I'm going to leave you now both to get on with your very busy lives supporting people. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Remember, don't forget, if you need your podcast fix, then we're back every Monday, proudly sponsored by Herts and Essex Fertility Centre, one of the top performing fertility clinics in the UK and has some of the best success rates in the east of England. If you want to find out more about My Surrogacy Journey, then please head over to our website, which is mysurrogacyjourney.com, or you can find us on Instagram at official My Surrogacy Journey. If you like this episode, then please subscribe to the series and we will be back for another episode in the coming weeks. Thank you for listening. You've had me all on my own today, which I actually really enjoy. I have been your My Surrogacy Journey podcast host. Goodbye.